How did we get the Old Testament? Part 1, the development of writing. The story of Jesus in the New Testament only makes sense as it follows and completes the story of Israel in the Old Testament. The Bible is a two-part saga, and if you cut out the first part, you mutilate the second part. If you've read parts of the Bible, you'll have noticed that the Old Testament is quite different from the New Testament. It took over 1,000 years to write the Old Testament through dozens of authors and spans 3,000 years of history, encompassing the rise and fall of many empires. In contrast, the New Testament was written mostly within 30 years by 9 authors, and it describes less than 100 years of history, all of it under the Roman Empire. The Old and New Testaments are held together by the covenants or agreements that God made with his people. What was the Old Testament written on? Stone was the earliest writing material, and then clay became a popular surface to write on. Sometimes words got etched into copper, silver, or gold. The most cutting-edge surface was the waxed wooden tablet. But I think you can see the drawbacks of all these writing surfaces. You would need an enormous amount of stone, clay tablets, and metal sheets to write the entire Old Testament. So when papyrus made from reeds along the Nile River, leather and parchment were invented, it was a game changer just because it was all more portable. To give us some perspective, the Egyptians were writing on papyrus made from thin-stemmed reeds starting around 3000 BC. That's more than 1,000 years before Moses was even born. Leather as a writing surface was tough to write on, but it was longer lasting than papyrus. By the 2nd century, leather was stretched and smooth, making it easier to write on, pliable and durable too. This processed leather was called parchment. The most common ink came from mixing soot with either vegetable oil or the sap of the acacia tree. What language was the Old Testament written in? Most of the Old Testament authors wrote in Hebrew. But when the Jewish people went into exile, they learned a language called Aramaic, commonly used for commerce and diplomacy. By the time their exile ended, many Jews spoke Aramaic as their primary language, and that's how Aramaic made its way into the New Testament. In part 2 of how we got the Old Testament, let's look at how these writings got preserved over the centuries.